Today I was thinking about the difficulties in relations between the sexes, and there are always difficulties, I suppose, in the relationships between the sexes, and there always have been. And it's just interesting to note these particular difficulties that exist at this particular period of time, which are very much capable of being distinguished from the difficulties in relationships that were commonplace or noticeable 10 years ago. So today, you have a certain, and always, you have a certain number of couples that can just get along with one another and function and procreate and propagate and continue the species. And there's a certain number of people made to be married couples. And one of the primary problems with our times is overpopulation has caused a lot of people to have anxiety about issues that were not really relevant. So a lot of people are worried about the population diminishing too much because most women aren't having children. Well, most of those people aren't supposed to have children. Biopower is a thing of the past. People who should be having children and people who should be having families and are having children. So it's not an issue, you know. There's lots of kids being born into 10 child families and so forth and so on. And yeah, obviously I think there are certain aspects of society that need to be regulated more thoroughly, like miscegenation and so forth. But specifically right now, the idea that there is a major issue with individuals who are into or who want to be into monogamy or what have you, that's incorrect. And that's the problem is not what it might seem. That being said, I wanted to analyze a problem that a lot of people are facing, and some will overcome and some won't. I was watching The Taming of the Shrew the other night, which is one of those universal plays that can never really grow old. If you don't appreciate Shakespeare, you're not really, whatever. And here's the problem. I've come to believe in reincarnation over a period of time, so I think a lot of people who are currently white aren't necessarily white now. And, a lot of people who come back as white, and those people, some people like me, come back as non-white as a punishment or what have you, and that you have to serve in your own personal hell, what have you. But the point of the matter is that white people don't appreciate Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. That's all there is to be said about that. But the problem in relationships today is that women are not or have not been raised to cooperate with men, but to compete with men. And Apex has actually done a lot, or been talking a lot about this lately, and that leaves women with a certain amount of confusion when they enter into a relationship with a man, because they think it's supposed to be a 50-50 partnership, and it's not. And of course, those people who were raised to be married at some point in their lives, in stable families that were not dysfunctional, or they were functional families intended to procreate and continue the lineage, which, adhering to basic mores and values that were instituted specifically to continue the lineage. Those people don't have this problem. But the vast majority of what we might call surplus people, which are the most visible people, you don't really see successful people that often. I travel a lot and I go to a lot of private residences, but anonymity is the greatest exhibition of wealth, or non-exhibition of wealth, as it were. It's a one of the primary trappings of wealth, to be sure. Anonymity, and yeah, a lot of people do not exist in the public eye, but those people that do have a issue being surplus people. They often have no reason to exist, but they're very much in public. They're all in public. They're all doing things in public, but often whatever they're doing is fairly superfluous. Anything that couldn't be done by a kiosk or a AI or something of that nature. So going back to the idea women can't cooperate with men, and this is a very important concept to grasp, because parents do this to their daughters because they're not raising their daughters to be, they don't want to think of themselves as raising their daughters to be wives, because what is a wife is basically a womb. It's basically a wife is naturally something of a doormat, and so for a man, specifically a man, he prefers the idea of his wife or his daughter as a competitive tomboy type, and he raises her to be extremely competitive. And at the same time, women raise their sons to be extremely accommodating of women. So it brings an awkward situation. This is why you see women so often in pictures in the forefront, and their husband, even though he's taller than her, will be a little behind her or a little below her or something like that, and she will be front and center in all her glory, and her husband will be a little behind her, all in the lesser pose, which is very just awkward, to be honest. It's very cringe, as the millennials would say, but it's just not. It's very the opposite of life affirming, to be sure. So you see these pictures a lot. These girls take their pictures with their boyfriend behind them or in front of them or something like that, and it's always the diminishment of the male form to the accentuation of the female form. And this started about 15 years ago. I remember you started seeing, like, in Sugarland started out as a three-person band because it was a stupid fad for a while to be three-person bands, none of whom played instruments or did it or even did much singing. So it was a bizarre trend, because in most, bands like trios, like, it wasn't a trio, it was a band. They didn't call it a trio. You have the Everly Brothers, I guess not a good example, but you had guys who were three or four guys, like there was multiple groups in the 70s, and they sang harmony and bass in different parts and so forth and so on. Now, in the modern era, the people didn't do any of that. They barely had parts in the song. In some cases, they had no parts at all, and yet they were part of the band. But anyway, Sugarland started as a three-person band. They got it down to two, and then it got down to where they were putting the man, who was superfluous anyway, in the background to the woman. So even though he was taller than her, in the album covers he would be portrayed as shorter than her. And this was not, not without some relevance, or not. There was some meaning behind it, because he didn't do anything anyway but strum a guitar. He didn't really play or anything like that. And he didn't sing except, whatever. So he was basically not even background vocalist to her. So it would be natural that he was portrayed as behind her and smaller than her, but in fact he was taller than her. But so this started to happen more and more at one point in time. And the female vocalists would wear taller heels and try to look better than or taller than their guitarist or whoever, look more imposing and look more startling. And so this trend became, it exercised its influence on the Zoomers, who are teenagers in their 20s today. So it's a very interesting trend that started, and obviously didn't start spontaneously or It wasn't the result of the stars who did it. There was a marketing campaign behind it. And I have to give the credit to individuals, roughly around my age that did come up with some very ingenious ideas, and their ingenuity will be probably the last of its kind, for a certain extent. But it's very interesting that a lot of the ideas that the younger people who have been inducted into the inner circles of power have come up with have been very good and very bloodthirsty, very not bloodthirsty necessarily as cold-blooded, because that small minority of that generation from the 80s is fairly cold-blooded. That certain millennial Gen X cusp is fairly cold-blooded. So, getting back to the topic at hand, we see the diminishment of the male, the accentuation of the female, the glorification of the female. We see Comte's wet dream comes to pass, and that is the glorification of the female. The female is so wonderful. She is the object of all our affections. We sacrifice unto her, so forth and so on. And I was talking incorrectly about how we'd reached peak women like 15 years ago, too. I was hoping, and now it's just gotten worse, to everything's detriment. But men don't like the idea of their daughters being cooperative with a man, with another man. And there are a lot of reasons for this. For one reason, if you have a daughter, that's a sign that you're a beta male. I don't like to get into the whole alpha and beta more, but one of the signs of an alpha male is that he has nothing but sons. And one of the signs of a beta male is that he has one or more daughters. He may have sons too, but the daughter is, the criteria by which we judge him, And he might have 10 sons and then have one daughter, but that's pretty rare. And even in that case, it makes him a greater beta or beta, but it does not. It still is very, very telling about his sexual or overall hierarchical position in life. Real alpha men only have sons. That's the bottom line. That is the criteria, the real criteria by which you can judge men. It's not, and if you understand this, you understand how the other factors and most other conditions by which people say you should judge alpha also fit into this, because then you start looking at men with multiple sons and you see, oh, this guy's serious business, a guy with two or three or more sons, that's a whole different ballgame. So that's the determining factor there in a man's hierarchical position. But men who have daughters are very different, and Steve Saylor has talked a lot about masculine men fetishize transsexuality in women, and this has gotten really out of hand in the science fiction community. It's become, a major problem of paraphilia in and of itself. And I'm just bringing this up in cohesion with what I'm talking about, because fathers want their daughters to be sons, even if they don't turn them into tomboys. They want them to be competitive with the boys, because it's a woman's world out there. And so the best a father-raised daughter can do, for the most part, is hope to be a good partner, a 50-50 partner to a man. Now, the problem is you have to diminish even the average weak male, who's going to be weak no matter what. The average male is going to be weak even in the most masculine of societies. You're dealing with a guy, the average guy, he's going to be fairly, weak. So he's especially weak in this society, and we're going to weaken him more. So he is accepting, or until he is accepting, of his 50-50 role with the female. And once he has accepted his 50-50 role, or his 50-50 willing the willingness to be 50-50 partners with a woman, then he is sufficiently diminished to be allowed to function to a degree as a productive or unproductive or what have you member of society. A lot of people wash out of it. A lot of people can't handle the idea of being 50-50 with a woman. And sticking them in that place is kind of like the whole Harrison Bergeron story. It screws them up, somebody running in place long enough. If you just make them stand there and run in place, and they're still outpacing the woman, that's bad for their psyche. So you have the whole deal, and then we go back to Macrobius, as we always do. Macrobius, this is how he raised his daughters. And yes, men prefer to have a submissive son-in-law, and men don't like the idea of having a powerful son-in-law, or a son-in-law more powerful than they are, for the most part. And vice versa, most really aggressive guys prefer to have a father-in-law who is somewhat nebbish. And this has been an interesting factor for some period of time. And it's very interesting to note the reality behind it. What inevitably happens is that a guy like Macrobius doesn't have anybody telling him what to do, and this is a grave problem, because one of the most important phrases Macrobius should naturally be cognizant of and using as he bows his head every day is "my Lord." That's what he should have somebody to bow to and say, "My Lord, I've been translating this Latin text for you," and so forth and so on, things like this. But the fact that Macrobius doesn't have an overlord means that his whole dynamic with his children is not what it should be. And this is why his sons are wastrels and his daughters, they can't be productive mothers, or what have you. They got their 2.2 children, I'm sure. It's whatever. We live a normie life. We both work. It's something they don't homeschool their children, nothing like, they want nothing to do with the orthodox homeschooling trad life that they were brought up in, because that's the way he made them. He made them into masculinized versions of women, and he made his sons into feminized versions of men. And he did this while entirely complaining to be or purporting to be the traddest of the trad, the most orthodox of the orthodox. And, the Bible says, "By their fruits you shall know them." So look at Macrobius' fruits, and you shall know him. It's very simple. Look at his kids, and you can see what kind of person he is. And, that's the bottom line. That's the most damning indictment I could possibly make of Macrobius. Oh, they're doing well. They're doing well, and absolutely they're doing well being bourgeois normies. I raised them to be bourgeois normies. Well, in that case, you need to stop pretending to be trad. You need to stop pretending to be on the side of anything rightist, anything hierarchical, anything monarchical, anything religious. Specifically religious. We'll just go with religious, because he could weasel his way out of everything else. But let's stop pretending that you are in any ways religious, Macrobius. So, and all that, with all due respect, I say that, with all due respect, Macrobius, you need to stop pretending to be religious. That's the bottom line. And this is the case with a lot of these fathers. I'm not even talking about secular individuals. I'm talking about people who specifically are in the right sphere. Whether they've taken the red pill or not. Look at Cernovich. Cernovich has daughters. He finally managed to have a son. I guarantee you he tried really hard. He read all the books. How can I have a son? These daughters are a complete waste of time. This is making me look very bad in my gorilla mindset. So he did what it took to have a son. And but he had 2 daughters first, which is, of course, another damning indictment. So, interestingly enough, this is what happens. This is what emerges. And, by their fruits, you shall know them. That's very clear, And So the end result again is these girls are raised up to compete or to allegedly run in a double harness, as one pastor said while performing. It was part of the marriage ceremony sermon or what have you. They're fixed to run in a double harness. So the idea of this being an American tradition has some precedence, that the wife and the husband are partners against the elements, and they're full 50-50 partners. Now, personally, I like the analogy that Ethel Kay came up years ago with on his blog, Married Man Sex Life, about the couple having the dynamic of a space or ocean-born ship captain. And the husband is the sea captain, or the ship captain, or the space ship captain, or what have you. And the wife is the first mate. And, this is a good, or the first officer. And this is a good dynamic, I think, for normie couples or couples of any kind. And so this is the kind of relationship I would advocate for normies. But this is the kind of relationship that is repulsive to guys like Macrobius for their children to have, because fundamentally, and here is the crux of the issue, people like Macrobius loathe young men of the younger generation. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, because people like Macrobius, the guys in Eagle Scout or whatever, right? You're supposed to be molding the guys of the younger generation to be the leaders and, at the forefront of the future. And you failed abysmally. You were too busy, it's hard to say what Boy Scouts do these days, nothing productive, to be sure. Getting merit badges for picking up trash or what have you, instead of learning any useful skills. Or we're going to sit around and practice tying knots. Well, nobody ties knots anymore. Who has the attention span to learn to tie knots? So, at the end of the day, learn to splice rope. Who has the attention span for all these crafts? The kids certainly don't. You give them candy and go door to door selling Girl Scout cookies for the Girl Scouts, something like that. So Macrobius, you have to remember, has presided over the decline of the Boy Scouts. This is why I make these points about Macrobius, because you have to be very careful, because he puts out a lot of content, and you have to realize the type of individual he is. And you have to realize the danger of listening to anything he says. He puts out a lot of educative content, and that's great, and that's to be commended. But he also says a lot of nonsense and a lot of garbage and a lot of disingenuous editorialism, not text, so to speak, that is deeply harmful to the younger men, because he had all these years to create the superior younger man. He had all these years to create the superior son. I would go out on a limb and say that none of his sons are Eagle Scouts like he was. And as I've said before, none of his kids can measure up to what he accomplished in life. And he's happy with that. He doesn't want them to measure up to what he accomplished in life. He doesn't want them to be more than he himself is or was. And that's the problem with that whole generation of parents. It's to a certain extent even worse with Generation X. They want to be better than their kids. They don't want their kids to outshine them, because they're not actually satisfied with their own laurels. Because their future was withheld by their seniors. So they believe it's their duty to withhold a future from their children. And so the vicious cycle continues. This is basically how child molestation exists. I've talked about, I didn't actually get around to talking about how child molestation is a basic way of helping keep the younger generations in their place. So you molest the most talented and, skillful younger or promising children as a way of controlling them in their future, so they don't potentially become a threat to your continued grasp of power, responsibility. You make them lesser than, you break their psyche, you make them weak, and then you can mock them and say, oh, look, he's addicted to drugs. He's 22 years old, such a promising future, and got addicted to drugs. Well, whose fault was it that he got addicted to drugs? It was mostly the older generations, primarily, the way they raised him. And they said, oh, I guess I was too indulgent, but I loved him so much. Yeah, it was a case of intentional indulgence to prevent that child from becoming a threat to your supremacy. Intentional indulgence, let me repeat that. You were intentionally indulgent because you wanted to continue looking down on your child, and you did not want your child to use its youthful energy to exceed you in any way. You didn't want your child to be more disciplined than you. You didn't want your child to be actually more educated in the more specific sense of the word. You didn't want your child to be more productive than you. You didn't want your child to have any of the graces or virtues it could have had. And this is very important to understand. And this is why older guys try to handicap younger men in this regard as well, by creating mates for them, women for them, who are going to challenge them and who are unable to cooperate, even when young women increasingly want to cooperate with men. They've been damaged, and they've had this idea that they must compete with men or face face abuse from men if they relinquish any of their non-existent attitude, or they have attitude, but it's non-existent. It's all a smokescreen. They've been given this bad behavior specifically to test the man, to make sure that man will not in any way seek to repair their bad behavior, because in a lot of ways there's a Hitler lurking in every husband, and so the initial Hitler test is to find out if the husband will correct the wife's bad behavior in any way. If the husband is indeed more disciplined, more complete, more together, and keeps his wife in line, and never actually has to threaten her, or I've seen this with very few couples, but there are couples where the man is just so, or whenever, this is just a generalized case, the man is so on the ball, the woman has to run to keep up. And that's the way it should just be in general. Any man should be sufficiently on the ball that the woman should naturally have to run to keep up while he walks. That should be, and keeping a woman on her toes is the way women should be. Nowadays, women aren't on their toes at all. They just seem like they're on their toes because everything is moving so slowly in modern society in terms of actually getting things done, and accomplishment, that we think that women are competent, but in fact we've created a whole society that works on feminine time, and then we think that's the way it's supposed to work. It's not, actually. If men actually strode purposely ahead, today's women would have to run to catch up. And a lot of people don't understand this. But again, this was intentionally done by Macrobius and individuals like him to prevent young men from getting ahead and potentially putting them in their place. I've been doing this for a number of years, and it's been a great help to Macrobius, because I was able to help Macrobius understand his place, and then he was able to help Pastor Lindstedt get more firmly established with his media presence in the midst of his troubles. So by browbeating Macrobius and putting him in his place, which, with all due respect to his years and his seniority or whatever, I was able to help the overall movement by forcing him to help Pastor Lindstedt. And so this is an example of how things can work for the good, and how younger men must sometimes put older men in their place. But overall, you have to understand, again, I work with women a lot, and they have to cooperate with me, and if they won't, I won't work with them. It's that simple. It's not, I don't have to necessarily work with anyone I don't want to. I'm very picky anymore, as a matter of fact. And if I don't like the attitude, and a lot of times I test women. Now, the other day we were in the rain for an hour, and I thought I'd test the lady and see what happens. Is she going to stand in the cold rain for an hour? I didn't need to stand in the cold rain for an hour, or work in the cold rain for an hour, but I thought, let's see what happens. I can handle the cold rain for an hour. Let's see how she takes it. And she handled it. And a lot of women that I tend to be willing to deal with are going to be like that, but they're a tiny percentage of women in general. If I'm even willing to be around a woman for an hour, then yeah, she's going to be a pretty small minority of her sex. So yeah, I totally understand, and most women don't, the idea of cooperation. It's the example brought forth in the Bible, which doesn't come up a lot in all these marriage parables that they draw from the Bible. And that is the one where Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son, and the servant asks the damsel, the virgin, to go, or asks her for a drink of water from her vessel, and she gives him, and freely volunteers to not only give him a drink of water from her vessel, but also to water his livestock, which is a much more time-consuming operation. And she has her own thing. She's busy already. She's going to get water for her own family. But she takes time out of her day to give water, first to a stranger, and second, to offer hospitality to him by watering his livestock. You say, oh, get that jug over there and water them yourself, see? And that's when he knows she is capable of being a fit wife for his master's son. So what does he do then? He rewards her. But she's not doing it in anticipation of any reward. She's doing it because she's that type of woman. So you don't see that type of cooperative woman in society very often anymore. And I think they do exist, and mostly below the radar, because if you have that type of woman, they get wifed up very quickly. Those women with good teachings, they get wifed up, and then they reap the rewards of being wifed up appropriately, as Rebecca did. She got the jewelry and the she got the bag, as the kids say. So those women that are like that get the bag fairly quickly, because people recognize their value, but other valuable people recognize value in people. But for the most part, the average woman is not taught to be cooperative in any way, shape, or form, and they just don't know how. Even when they want to be cooperative, they don't know how. They are incapable of being cooperative, and of course, their ostensible partners are incapable of teaching them to be cooperative. So we see that the older generation has thoroughly destroyed the ability of large numbers of the population. Now, granted, it's the surplus population, so it doesn't really matter. But they have destroyed the ability of large numbers of these people to have any kind of decent marriage. And my thesis is that the older generation should indeed be forced to pay for their mistakes in this life, and be forced to pay not only monetarily, but also, and karmically. They're going to pay karmically, but they should also be forced to pay in the sense of receiving justice for or being forced to face justice for their actions.